I think the biggest obstacle any man faces in his life is always himself, on some level. There's a saying that I use a lot, which is the only thing between the man we are and the man we want to be is the man we had to become. And I think overcoming the obstacle of the man that we had to become is our biggest problem, and can often be a life's work, because we start off on this journey and we start to build our character, certain things we believe in, certain things that we learn are important, and we go on a trajectory. And at some point, and at points, there's trauma. And people, when they think of trauma, they think of always like it be sexual abuse or death or things like that. Yes, they are traumatic, but what I mean by trauma can be those things, but it can also be any event where you're not physically, intellectually, emotionally, or spiritually equipped to be able to deal with it. So what happens at that moment is everything we've learned about the world no longer makes sense. It no longer makes sense. That can't be true. And so we have to work out a new way to survive in that situation. So we have to overcome that problem. So the brain scans for what it can. And usually in that moment, we take on a lesson about ourselves or the world, which we believe is true for this to make sense. So if you use an example of someone who, well, let's take abuse, for example. Someone gets abused at some stage, and they may take on that they can't trust anyone, right? Or that they are not worthy of saying no. They have no boundaries. What they say doesn't matter. They're just there for other people. So they take on that belief to make the world make sense. Well, it must mean I can't trust anyone. That needs to be true. So what happens is we never see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. So from then, they create what in psychology is called a schema. So they create a model of the world, and the brain is constantly scanning for evidence for that to be true, because the brain needs a framework that makes sense. So they live through that. So from that point, they're living with a belief that they can't trust anyone. So they isolate. So they become distrustful themselves. They monitor their behaviour, and because of their behaving a certain way, they're getting certain results. So at some stage, you get to a point where you go, wow, my life isn't working. Or my life is working, but somehow I feel happy. And it's because from that break, your character ended and your persona took over. The version of yourself that you have to present to the world to survive is what took over. And you get to a certain stage, and it tends to be around about middle age, where you get exhausted with that, whether it's working or not. Jim Carrey says a brilliant thing where he says depression is when your persona just refuses to turn up anymore. It just says, I'm tired of acting, being this person who I'm not. And that tends to happen here. And all of that stuff in the middle was the man we had to become to survive. And that has created the arc to the man we are. So when we're looking at the man we want to be, we have to start looking at the man I had to become and tracing that backwards till we can start getting to what the core beliefs are, the core events that changed it. And everything in the middle is an obstacle. And we either learn from it, turn it into something good, or we find ways to dissolve it or replace the beliefs that don't work for us. And that space in the middle, that's what we call the work. That work is going back, ironing that out, so that you have half a chance of becoming the man you could have always been before life got in the way. So our obstacles pretty much are always ourselves. And sadly, they are in a response to our environment. So if you have it's funny. I was almost going to say if you have a tougher upbringing, but one of the great things that I've learned, particularly from my involvement with the Mankind Project, is, and meeting so many different men from around the world, is I used to think that like I had a tough background, that means things were worse for me, right? And suddenly you go and you start hearing stories about like boarding schools. Like, man, as boarding schools, I used to think, these posh kids, they go off to boarding schools and they get to ride horses and shoot guns and sail boats and all of that, right? And I'm not going to say there ain't advantages of that. But then a man said to me one day, just imagine what that's like when you're 10 years old and your family sends you away. And then suddenly you've got teachers who are not really around, or at worst, rough on you, because we're talking about the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, when things were very different. And you're living in that hierarchy of boys the whole time. I mean, it's a savage background. So I'm correcting myself from, I often think if you have a tough background, it's not about having a tough or a privileged background. Life will punch you in the face many times in your life, regardless, right? You know, you can have, your life's going perfectly and you've got a great dad, you love him, great mum, one of them dies, right? Bang. You know, suddenly there's an economic change. Bang. Look at all the people living, whether you're in Gaza at the moment or Israel, whether you're in Palestine or Israel. There's kids there whose life has just changed overnight. Parents gone, displaced, witnessed terrible things. It can happen to anyone, and it does. This is the sort of illusion of life, is that it's bad things happening is a break from the norm. It is the norm. Bad things are going to happen. Even if you're in a loving, if you're lucky enough to be in a loving relationship with someone now, one of you is going to watch the other one die. Shit is going to happen. And so always being able to go back to character rather than persona, going back to who am I really, how do I respond from this really, how do I respond from my heart, what's the medicine I can bring to this situation rather than the poison, what's the lesson I can learn, where can I grow? Bringing those elements into your life is how we overcome obstacles. So yeah, we're our biggest obstacle. How we learn to respond to the obstacles that life gives us is what helps us thrive or causes us to perish.